Article 8, Evaluation of Archaeological Resources, should correctly be named Lexington Archaeological Sensitivity Study. The proposed project and request for funds is based upon the need for Lexington to consider all aspects of its cultural heritage in its future planning, not just the buildings in the Cultural Resources Inventory. This brief presentation will highlight some of the types of resources whose locations deserve evaluation so that future planning and proposed construction can take steps to assure their preservation. Other communities throughout Massachusetts have completed similar studies and now include this information in their planning process. The image you see before you was taken on Spring Street. It's a view west, showing the boundary stone wall between what was once West Farms and Watertown, and likely dates to the 1640s. Two white oak boundary trees mark the town line on both sides of Spring Street. The westward wall expands extensively, as shown in the image on the left. First, I'd like to review the steps for protecting our cultural heritage through archaeological sensitivity mapping. An example will be provided toward the end of the presentation. But the first step is documentary and field research to identify archaeologically sensitive areas. Historic era covers the past 400 years, and pre-contact or prehistoric era covers the Native American occupation of the past 12,000 years. Draft report for the archaeological sensitivity maps is the second step, and the final report will include sensitivity maps and implementation guide. It is important that town meeting members understand that the extent and types of archaeological resources in the town before we discuss the type of bylaw which would be appropriate for protecting these resources. The second step would be the approval of a bylaw to protect these resources. A timeline provides the overall perspective on what we are dealing with for the cultural history of Lexington. It begins with the Paleo-Indian era, 12,000 years ago, through the Archaic period, into the Woodland period, which included the development of agriculture, and then the arrival of the colonial settlers in around 1630. Let me briefly review the resource types that we're talking about for the pre-contact and post-contact periods. For the pre-contact Native American archaeological sites, they will likely comprise either seasonal camps for hunting and fishing or long-term occupancy sites for agriculture. For the post-contact or historic era, the sites would likely include both homestead sites from the 1640s and 50s through the early decades of the 1900s. They would include historic landscape features such as stone walls, town and property boundary markers, and animal enclosures. Residential and features would include wells and privies, as well as terraced gardens. And there are also historic industrial sites, the mill sites, the water channels, mill ponds, and building foundations. In the next few slides, I'd like to review some examples of archaeological features and artifacts. In the early 1820s, the Robbins family of East Lexington constructed an observatory tower on what they named Mount Independence. It became a gathering place, particularly on holidays, for picnics and general celebration. It is claimed that one could see the ships of Boston Harbor from the top of the observatory, which is pictured in the middle of the slide here. A lightning strike in the 1840s resulted in the demise of this particular observatory. However, today we can see the remembrance of this location in the stones of the landscaped historic garden and home at 12 Summit Road. On the right, you can see a cannon wall. The cannons of Major Percy were brought as part of the reinforcements from Boston on April 19th as part of the retreat of the British column through Lexington. As they were attacked from various points along Massachusetts Avenue, it is certainly likely that they fired their cannons to disperse the armed colonials that gathered along the route at strategic points. One of these places was the Heights at Cliff Avenue. Evidence of such an action was discovered in a backyard on Cliff Avenue in East Lexington. The 3-pounder pictured here is from the heights of Clifford Avenue, which overlooks Mass Avenue, the road the retreating British took with their light field artillery. Next, I'd like to look at some historic archaeological landscapes. On the left, you can see an image of the Monroe family land with a brook which drained into a pond known today as Arlington Reservoir. The outline of the mill pond remains, although the outfall has been modified with a stone culvert. The Harrington family established a homestead on the south side of Great Meadow. With the meadow being an ideal grazing area, they used the stones from cleared fields to create a guided path or cart road for moving their cattle, sheep, and wagons between the farm and Bay Path, today known as Mass Avenue. Next, I'd like to look at a living historic landscape and a potential prehistoric archaeological site. The orchards at Cotton Farm Conservation Area contain both evidence of historic farming, attested to by the stone walls, and also terrain of an historic and contemporary fruit orchard that form integral parts of the historic landscape. You can see in the left image over the stone wall an area where an historic orchard dating back possibly 100 years exists. On the right, you can see over the stone wall the contemporary orchard, which was planted about 35 years ago. In the middle, you can see an area which contains an accessible path constructed along the ridge above a pond. This type of location, any New England archaeologist would tell you, was a prime location for a prehistoric archaeological site. Had an archaeological survey been conducted in this area, an alternative type of route construction might have been taken place to prevent the destruction of what is a high potential prehistoric location. As the prior images have suggested, stone walls are a key element of the historic archaeological landscape. Thousands of walls exist throughout Lexington, as is illustrated by the map of the town on the left. Each one of the red lines or dots is a segment of stone wall. This map was created 15 years ago based on high-resolution aerial imagery. However, ground survey indicates that these more than 3,000 stone wall segments are incomplete. In fact, 3 or 4 times that many stone walls may exist in the town. None of these historic landscape features are in the current Lexington Cultural Resources inventory. Massachusetts law requires consideration of all cultural resources in projects as seen in the wording of the legislation, but for administrative reasons, only if state or federal funds are involved does a review of project impacts on archaeological resources take place. Municipally funded projects don't get the same level of consideration, regardless of the importance or significance of resources they impact or destroy. We have an example of the omission of considering archaeological resources in the Battle Green Streetscape project. The project proposes 3 intersections with roundabouts. Each of these intersections is the site of a known or potentially significant historic archaeological site. Area A on the right, at Mass Avenue and Bedford Streets, by the Minuteman statue, was the site of the first and second meeting houses. Area B in the top, at Harrington Road and Bedford Street, was part of the town common in 1775, as Bedford Street did not then exist. This area is part of the field of fire for the engagement on April 19th and may contain archaeological evidence of this fact. Area C on the left at Harrington Road, Mass Avenue, in front of the old burying ground entrance, was part of the town pond on the town common. Excavation associated with the roundabout may disclose the drainage system first installed in 1801 and later expanded in 1860. Verifying the construction of this drainage works would contribute to explaining why so many graves were relocated or destroyed in the old burying ground. Let's next take a look at a couple of archaeological sensitivity maps. Acton is one of the towns that has undertaken a town-wide archaeological survey. The area shown on the map below is a section of the sensitivity map for the prehistoric era. The pink areas are high probability and the modern areas are in blue. The area of West Acton has rather low or only moderate areas of archaeological sensitivity for prehistoric resources. That same area in the historic era has a relatively high probability of historic resources. West Acton had a railroad station and was one of the early areas of settlement in the town. There are 12 town-wide archaeological sensitivity surveys completed in Massachusetts. Each survey was done to more completely evaluate each of the town's cultural resource inventories. The completed survey allows the town to consider means of protecting the destruction of these resources. Often this is done through a town bylaw. This can be considered in Lexington after a sensitivity analysis is complete. Let me summarize with a best case scenario. If an archaeological sensitivity study is approved, it can be completed this summer, and a draft bylaw can be completed in September in time for fall town meeting to discuss and adopt this bylaw. This will assure the preservation of some of our critical historic and prehistoric resources. Thank you.